Hey iPrevent viewers, it's Lolly here. This month's video, entitled Don't You Love Me, is covering toxic relationships, specifically in relation to human trafficking. Trigger warning: this content that we speak of may include or imply human trafficking, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. You may be wondering, what does human trafficking have to do with iPrevent? Well, here at iPrevent, we are preventing HIV, hepatitis C, and substance use among youth 13 to 24 years old. Unfortunately, human trafficking often involves youth and much of what we're trying to prevent. If you ever have been to one of iPrevent's Sex Ed and Chill sessions, you've helped us write the list for why people refuse to wear condoms. On every list, the "Don't you love me?" guilt statement comes up. Sometimes, people will attempt to guilt trip their partners in order to get their way, and this can be considered toxic behavior. Unfortunately, guilt trips are one of the ways traffickers maintain control of their victims. "Don't you love me" can be easily added to the list of other guilt trips like, "Don't you want food? Don't you want money? Don't you want a place to stay?" According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, traffickers exploit others for the profit gained from forced labor and commercial sex. They lure and ensnare people into forced labor and sex trafficking by manipulating and exploiting their vulnerabilities. Exploiting vulnerabilities. Let's get more explicit about what exploring their vulnerabilities means. Traffickers learn where the victims are weak in mind or lack in resources and use promises of bettering those areas to build a relationship with their victims. These seemingly helpful relationships quickly become toxic and damaging as traffickers resort to sex trafficking, physical violence, forced labor, and so much more. In 2014, Covenant House did a study on youth trafficking in 13 cities, including New Orleans, Louisiana. Nearly 1 in 5, or 19.4%, of the 911 youth interviewed were victims of human trafficking, with 15% having been trafficked for sex, 7.4% trafficked for labor, and 3% trafficked for both. They also found that 21% of young women and 10% of young men interviewed had been trafficked for sex. 27% of LGBTQ youth reported experiences consistent with the U.S. federal definition of sex trafficking. 32% of the youth interviewed had engaged in some way in the sex trade at some point. 41% of them were young females, and 25% were young men, and 56% of them were of the transgender youth. 68% of the youth who had either been trafficked or engaged in survival sex or commercial sex had done so while homeless, showing that youth who are homeless are especially vulnerable to trafficking. It's also important to talk about how youth who are exposed to human trafficking are often exposed to substance use. The National Institute on Drug Abuse for Teens, or NIDA, speaks on human trafficking and its relationship with substances. NIDA explains that trafficking of illegal drugs and human trafficking often happen together. Drug traffickers may also be transporting people as another source of money, forcing their victims to smuggle drugs across borders, using drugs as bait to recruit people who have a substance use disorder, or using drugs to force a victim to obey their orders. Some victims of human trafficking may even resort to using substances as a response to the trauma of their trafficking victimization. The supply of drugs provided by the trafficker often inhibits or causes their victims to feel dependent on their trafficker as they easily become addicted to the substances. This is a prime example of the toxic relationships that traffickers establish for personal gain. Human trafficking, especially sex trafficking, also leads to higher HIV and STI risks. Traffickers sometimes frame themselves as boyfriends or family to gain trust. These traffickers guilt trip their victims and/or force them into commercial sex work. Unfortunately, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Women's Health, states that sex trafficking victims are at high risk for getting HIV among other sexually transmitted infections. Sex trafficking victims may be forced into prostitution and may be sexually assaulted, including being forced to have unprotected sex with multiple partners, many of whom have had unprotected sex with many partners. This increases their risk of getting HIV. Human trafficking is impacting youth all over, but the unhealthy relationships involved in human trafficking are the extremes of relationship toxicity. Most youth are not victims of human trafficking, and we want to keep it that way. Let's encourage each other to seek positive relationships and focus on healthy sexuality and relationships to increase resilience to traffickers. So here we are. What does a healthy relationship look like? Thanks to loveisrespect.org and the National Domestic Violence Hotline, I was able to put together a list of some things a healthy relationship should include. Mutual respect, a safe space to openly speak to one another about thoughts and feelings, feeling heard when expressing feelings, not being critical of each other, feel supported to do the things they like, celebration of each other's accomplishments and successes, trust, boundaries, no pressure to do what you're not comfortable with, no physical or emotional abuse, financial freedom, freedom to have accessible friends and family, no guilt, and of course, consent. So when someone asks you, "Don't you love me?" understand that the love for your health and peace is most important. Love is not used for manipulation or guilt. Resources in New Orleans. Before we close out, I want to give you some resources that could be helpful for yourself and anyone who may be a victim of human trafficking. If you or someone you know is a survivor of human trafficking and they're seeking behavioral health services, detox, primary care, or anything else, Odyssey House Louisiana has services for you. Call our outreach number at 504-418-4955 for information about our programs. Also, if you think that you have come in contact with a human trafficking victim, call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center's hotline at 888-373-7888. You can also text HELP to BeFree to 33733. Hotline staff can help you figure out whether you've seen a victim of human trafficking and can suggest local resources.
Don't forget to follow us on Facebook at iPrevent OHL and Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat at iPrevent_OHL.
Signing off, but never stopping our work at iPrevent.
Thanks for listening to
iPrevent Radio. Don't forget to download our app. It's now available and free for Androids and iPhones. Just go to the Google Store or the App Store and search iPrevent OHL.